Okay, now we're live on YouTube, and I will start. Hello, good evening, everyone. No, not yet. Good evening, everyone. Good evening for those who watch us or with us in Moscow or somewhere nearer. But our guests today are from the other side of the Atlantic. So good morning for those who watch us in the United States or in other places across the ocean. My name is Alexander Strogorsky. I'm teaching at the Moscow Architecture School March. Welcome to another meeting of the series of talks about architecture education and how it could be changed or has to be changed or pressured to be changed because of new circumstances, whatever we consider them to be. The meeting will be held in English. You can use the globe icon on your control panels in Zoom to switch to translation. Наша встреча будет на английском языке, и если вам нужен русский перевод, то вы можете найти на панели управления в Zoom значок глобуса и переключиться на русский язык. The reason to have these conversations, or the trigger, I would say, is that this spring and summer, architectural schools found themselves in the very middle of huge changes in how we work and how we think and how we communicate. I think I was, well, maybe saying it before, but I think it's maybe the first time when architecture schools are not reacting to some changes that are going on in the kind of real world, but are in the front and center of what's going on, because before anything changed in public space, before, I don't know, there are discussions of how office spaces should be changed. Even before that, architecture schools had to change the way they teach and had to figure out how to do lectures and seminars and studios online. And it's a good way, it's a good chance to think about the foundations of architectural education. That's why March Architecture School, being a relatively new institution founded just 8 years ago, decided to invite educators and experts from other schools and other places to discuss the past and present and future of architectural education. Last time when we discussed it with Troy Sham, David Duane, and Daniel Roche, we already started discussing that it might be easier for new schools to experiment, to change the direction, but it might be harder for established institutions, for large institutions with a long history. This would be partly the topic of today's conversation: how large institutions develop themselves through criticism, through self-criticism, irony, smart manipulation with the established rules of education and discipline. I will introduce our guest today. Anna Miljački is a critic, curator, and associate professor of architecture at MIT, where she teaches history, theory, and design, a very pleasant thing for me personally, because I also teach history and theory, and I started participating in design studios just this year. It's good to feel that history and theory could be used in a more kind of direct way. Her research interests range from the role of architecture and architects in the Cold War era Eastern Europe, through theories of postmodernism and late socialism, also a very interesting topic, to politics of contemporary architectural production. She was part of the 3-member curatorial team with Eva Frank and Gilbert and Ashley Schaefer of the US Pavilion in the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, where the project Office Us critically examined the last century of US architects' global contribution. In 2018, Anna launched the Critical Broadcasting Lab at MIT, the different projects that were part of exhibitions and architectural biennales. And I guess we'll discuss some of those projects today. And our second guest, Sara Hirschman, is an architect and the founder of Practice Object Projects. She's a lecturer at the University of California and was 2017-18 Lefebvre Emerging Practitioner Fellow at the Norton School of Architecture. What I like in this introduction is how much in the United States and in Europe, how much different fellowships and programs you have. I'd like to have that much in Russian. Sara explored the expression of linguistic figures of humor through objects, patterns, and shifts of scale. And her research has also focused on legal interpretations of architectural originality. Sara and Anna together produced an exhibition, Unfair Use, which was focused on how architects copy, mimic, use, and reuse the architectural vocabulary of forms and ideas, which is also very, not just only professional, but also very educational thing, because that's what students do usually. They use something. Well, I'm done with my introductions, and now give our virtual floor to Anna and Sara.
Thank you, Sasha. So we thought we would begin by acknowledging the historical importance of this moment, which the series already does in some way, or as a central topic. The moment in which we speak with perhaps too little distance, some might say, but I think grappling with this moment as we live in it seems the most honest and necessary way to operate. This, of course, assumes that we make mistakes. So we hope you'll give us, room for those. And if they're good mistakes, we'll learn from them. The global dimension of this epidemic, its pan part, certainly seems unprecedented in the living memory. And it indeed provides what Arundhati Roy has described a few months ago in April as an important portal. So how we walk through that portal, a disruption that's provided by the pandemic, will be consequential. And I believe that the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and elsewhere, but particularly in US, is the most uplifting and important way for the US to walk through that portal. So we are grateful to you, Sasha Ostrogorsky, to Yevgeny As, and to Maj for providing us this platform to think with you about architectural education as it refracts through our historical moment, and it too passes through that portal. So there are many ways why our current moment might point to necessary changes in architecture and elsewhere. But it really shouldn't be shocking to anyone who was paying attention that changes are necessary. It's just that perhaps this moment, in this moment, we may finally have a kind of collective energy and the escape velocity necessary for real systemic change. But prompted by the topic described by Sasha just a second ago, and this notion of deschooling and the series as it has been going on right now, we thought that we would discuss transformations in pedagogy as not, or not only as a kind of a singular moment of transformation, but that we can, in a way, talk about the ethos of experimenting with and transgressing the disciplinary boundaries. And this is why I think we were sort of just now given a kind of notion of old schools that need to transform and how they might get there. But what's important, I think, to think about sort of from the outset as a framework for what we might talk about today is that in a way, in architecture schools of any kind, we are tasked by reproducing the discipline. We also always enable the next generation to take on the unknown. And at different historical moments, there have been sort of different attitudes towards this. Some of them are graced with less and some with more awareness about the fact that we are teaching for the unknown. and some with more and less assuredness about what architecture is or could be. So, but whether we believe that the unknown is always part of the equation or is particularly unstable and unpredictable at any given time, how might we, or how could our students reorient the discipline with the tools that it has provided them or us, is, I think, a question that we must ask ourselves as educators of architecture. Because after all, we are giving them tools that the discipline reproduces, hoping that they produce the unknowable. So that's a kind of a larger framework within which different things that we were thinking about talking to you about fit, I think. And then we can undo it as we go.
I mean, it's a lot, right? So there is the kind of larger project of advancing and poking at the discipline and experimenting within pedagogy. And then there's also the urgency of the present. Like, how can we, you know, almost the frantic need to make use of this kind of horrible global pandemic portal situation to make the, or set up the terms to make the world that we'd only kind of imagined previously, right? So the stakes are suddenly so much higher and so much more urgent. The kind of politics of kind of the power relationship, we can already almost start to think as kind of the seed or the kernel around which a lot of other experiments are taking place. So that when I talk about the power relationship, like obviously the student and the teacher, but also the institution and the pedagogue and the, you know, discipline at large and the student who goes out into it. You know, starting in the studio, starting in education, to reform that relationship and how, you know, one term might inform the other, necessarily, we hope, right, goes out into the world with the student afterwards, so that they can feel freer to kind of question the norms that are around them. This isn't necessarily on our little bullet point list. I'm already diverging before we've even begun. But I'm reminded of, you know, the moment every semester when it occurs to me that my students are going to go out into the world and encounter the discipline that I work in, and that it's not going to look like their studio. And prior to this moment, where we all have kind of heightened awareness, necessarily so, of the Black Lives Matter movement, but even thinking of a very kind of white feminist perspective from which I'd previously been oriented, talking to my students every semester and saying, guess what, like, you're going to go have a job and it's going to look different from studio. And you know right now in this moment that your female classmates are just as competitive as you, just as able as you. And it's possible that you would go out into the world and take advantage of, you know, the privilege you've been given, as, you know, your older colleagues will see you. And you could lean on that, or you could be an agent for change. And so it's that much more kind of important for us to stir up those conversations in studio, so that they, you know, go into the world empowered. But we can get back on track a little bit.
Well, I want to go back to, so just to maybe introduce the critical broadcasting lab that Sasha referred to in my bio, and maybe to bring us back for a second to the kind of what he called old schools of architecture. And certainly MIT is, you know, proud to be the oldest school of architecture in the US, now at least 150 years old. But so I started in 2018, an entity that in various ways I had been building up through research and pedagogical work for a while. So some of the things that I think of now, or that I sort of think of the body of work that in a way belongs to it, happened before it in fact existed as such. But the Critical Broadcasting Lab at MIT was a kind of particular kind of space in which we could think, yes, through curatorial work, through exhibitions and broadcasts of any kind, and think about what that means, what it means to produce and introduce statements into a world highly saturated already with various kinds of megaphones. And to think about that sort of media ecology in which we would be entering. But its role at MIT is also pedagogical and political. It provides a space of reflection that is collectively shared and shaped. And it carves out time that's dedicated to and packaged with the elements of professional education. It teaches roles for producing the distance necessary for critical operations. So something that might, in fact, my hope is that would, in a way, enable and cultivate ways for young architects and scholars to question the discipline itself, to question the authority of the academy, to question their own position once they are wherever they are, in academy or in practice. And so Critical Broadcasting Lab reserves the space for thinking politically and critically with an open-endedness towards the aesthetic and critical outcomes of that thinking, which means that it doesn't task the students to immediately think about architectural outcomes of their urgent political and critical thoughts. Sometimes, there are certainly a series of different temporal lines that course through one's academic experience. Some of them are about the events that are happening right around us that we feel as citizens we need to respond to. Some of them are timelines of practice, which are a very different kind of clock. Some of them are timelines of transformation of the field, which are yet another kind of clock, and they are all connected. But so the Critical Broadcasting Lab allows questions to cook and be worked on their own timeline without having to sort of arrive at a architectural design solution. So building is not its main topic, but that also doesn't mean that building isn't one of the topics that we think about. So we're interested in, cultivating and kind of an experimental attitude towards making architecture public and everything that makes it possible public, in order to produce robust criticism of the discipline's contemporary, historical, and future entanglements with forces beyond that sort of safe academic outline. Though it's useful that it is within academia and it doesn't, in its production of criticism and exhibitions, it doesn't have to respond to a kind of framework of museums or some kind of contest in popularity. So the first project that the Critical Broadcasting Lab took on was part of a larger set of experiments in pedagogy that MIT put on to celebrate its 150th birthday. And that was in many ways instigated by our head at the time, Mi Jin-yoon, who thought that the best way to celebrate its longevity and oldness was to actually go back to a question about sort of experimenting with pedagogy itself. And so for the Critical Broadcasting Lab, the experiments were called Agit Arch experiments, and they dealt with citizenship, clickbait politics, and questions of populism, all of which in a way orbit around or encompass architecture, but in ways that we wanted to sort of look at more closely with a series of different characters that we brought in to talk about them. And so in a way, some aspects of certainly the kind of project that I feel as an OR project, that I present as an OR project for the Critical Broadcasting Lab, is one that Sara and I started together on copying, copyright, authorship, and originality, which was first a seminar on these topics. Do you want to take that one on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in 2012. So a good deal before, but definitely kind of, you're talking about cooking as part of the Critical Broadcast Lab's mandate. That's certainly something that's been simmering for a while in a lot of different kind of media or a lot of different branches. So that copyright or architecture in the age of copyright seminar was, at least in my experience of it, and I think that it's probably the case for you too, it came out of a question of, you know, what does it mean to copy, and how are people kind of using the ubiquity of images of architecture productively or smartly or mindlessly. So almost responding, I think that's before Instagram, I think. But it was definitely, you know, people were starting to use Pinterest. You're starting to see in studio just a lot of images and not great depth of knowledge behind what they were representing. And so thinking about, you know, how can we bring a group of students together, a graduate seminar of people, you know, individually researching topics relative to copying. How can we bring people together to question the act of copying and how it has kind of historically operated within the discipline as both a kind of seed for originality and also a kind of accepted practice to reuse and mine and understand what's come before.
I mean, with that particular one, we were trying to really intervene in the kind of field in which there was an exponential transformation, let's say, or fundamental transformation in the way in which information, visual information about architecture was traveling without any historical baggage that might come with it. And still we were in the moment where very much the kind of expectation of novelty was the thing that was understood, certainly in studio, as the kind of at the core of the discipline. And so we were suggesting that actually also the other, not only the expectation of novelty, but a kind of reference and understanding of the discipline were equally important for the discipline's definition. And so in that sense, we were playing with what gets to, in a way, define the core of the discipline, or what must be known in order to be either original or subconsciously not original, maybe. But it was also a moment where the legislative apparatus in the US, at least, was beginning to emerge. So with the Architectural Works Copyright Protection Act, which was passed in 1990, basically this field began to be codified legally, which is true also in other branches of aesthetic production. Well, that's not true. The novelty of it wasn't true in other branches of aesthetic production, but you see a whole series of lawsuits in music and fashion that are now more common, in part in alignment with the fact that visual information is traveling at speeds it has never traveled before. So these were some of the sort of things that for us were important in that first moment, sort of and again, for me, the kind of codifying a space in which, or allowing for our audiences and our students to see a space in which they would be able to be critical, or would need to be critical in their production of architecture.
And for me, just to jump in on the AWCPA mention, for me, that happened kind of mid-semester. So we had a robust syllabus with all kinds of readings and copying kind of historically and visual arts, et cetera. And then kind of stepping back for a moment and saying, okay, what's the actual law? Like, what is the wording of the law that pertains to architecture? We brought in somebody, I think, from maybe the legal affairs department at MIT to speak, and realized that actually the text of the AWCPA is super weird and super interesting and incredibly adjacent to, but not overlapping with necessarily architecture's own definition, the discipline of architecture's own kind of self-knowledge or self-image. So in order to have a kind of successful claim of copyright infringement in architecture, you have to prove both that something is architecture and that it has been copied. And so you have to kind of define what is original in architecture. And so the law does that for us in a way that we found is super different from the way that, say, Arc Record does, or, Building Blog, or any of these kinds of not image-based, but highly image-rich resources that we and our students were looking at.
Or even disciplinary, right?
Yeah.
We don't even, yeah.
And so there's this kind of disconnect that I think for both of us has been incredibly productive and provocative over the intervening 8 years. Certainly a lot has happened in architectural copyright legislation, and also the fluency of the way we kind of work with images and the discipline has changed tremendously in that time.
And so
Sorry,
I wanted to just, for me, I have talked to legal scholars about some of this question about why are architects not taking architects to court on IP issues. And I've been sort of politically leaning towards open source in every sort of explanation of that, but in a fairly sort of amateur way. Basically, the discipline reproduces itself through references and through knowledge of the discipline. And all architects know what goes into their own personal sort of process of designing. And I was trying to explain this to the legal scholars, but Sara has actually been looking into what it might mean to talk about open source in the context of architecture in specific terms and in legal terms.
I mean, super excitingly for me, I mean, it's early in our conversation, but I'm getting excited about it. Like the notion that, we know that there is a public domain, right? There's a certain body of architectural knowledge that is not available. And in fact, this is what our exhibition was about, to kind of return to how we got here. It's fair use, right? So in our exhibition, we produced, the initial one was 40 fair use kind of moves that were identified as kind of tropes or kind of formal moves, for lack of a better word, that any architect could use, because kind of importantly, we were able to identify, like, within the previous 15 years of architectural history, they'd been used 3 times. And so what our kind of beginner legal knowledge at that point had pointed us to was that if you could give a kind of zeitgeist defense and say that everybody's using this move, everybody's making a building that looks like a wave, or everybody's making a building, I have the poster of our moves up on my wall, so I'm looking at it, for a leaning high par, then nobody could potentially claim that it's their own and accuse you of infringement. And so therefore, by virtue of us kind of identifying them as fair use moves, they were free and open for everybody, not only students, but also the practice, the discipline to, mash and remash and put together as they see fit, without fear of being called out for infringement or retribution.
I mean, there was definitely also humor and irony in those moves to sort of to the earlier point about them. Some of the, yeah.
But the notion that there is this body of fair use, like that, I'm thinking almost back to like pattern books, right? Like there's this content that is free for us to use without fear in a super kind of contentious, litigious atmosphere. That to me is something that is incredibly provocative for the future of the discipline, because there is this public domain that is not currently being defended. And so in my kind of more recent research, I've been looking into the rise of copyright trolls in architecture. It's 30 years since the passage of the law, and only in the past 7 has the kind of prevalence of the copyright troll, or the possibility for them to make money off of just constantly needling small scale contractors for small settlements, has that really risen up. And that I think probably ties in a little bit to what we wanted to talk about in terms of pedagogy as well, thinking about the collective of architecture. Who has the right to use these moves? Who has the right to build according to designs or ideas that are kind of collectively owned by the discipline? And who kind of gets to mete out the boundaries and gatekeep a little bit? Often it has to do with who's holding kind of the keys to the lawsuit. And that it just strikes me as, you know, patently unfair that a contractor in Colorado gets sued and doesn't know what his rights are. There should be a kind of public service that steps in to say, you own the right to build the house that you're building, or you as a member of the public do. But there's no such agency in the US as of yet. So I'll continue writing about it. I don't know how quickly that's going to bring about change. Unfortunately.
I want to go to the notion of collective authorship, which, you know, somehow in our exhibit, the fair use exhibit, and in some of this sort of notion of the open source is already embedded. Certainly, it was in some ways also part of the Office US project that Eva and Ashley were co-curated with me, in which we wanted to look at the national body of work produced over 100 years for the first time as such, such that, you know, the kind of avant-garde moves or canon were slightly displaced by the way we were looking at the body of work produced by US firms over 100 years. And certainly my own studies of the Czechs working under socialism contribute to this, as well as my own experience. But this is why, for me as a teacher, I have been repeatedly compelled to ask, what would it mean to upend the cult of individual genius in architecture and to enable a kind of an intelligence, protocols, and values of the collective? And this partly also perhaps in response to spending the last long time in the US since I left Serbia. And then also questions like, what would it mean to sidestep the market? How do we transform the school to allow for both of those questions to begin to be, well, if not answered, at least tested through answers? And so I've been thinking about how to sort of introduce this studio, which collective architecture studio, which I taught through now the Critical Broadcasting Lab at MIT, or with all of its sort of framework and mission, and the idea that we could produce on any register in that studio, because it's a bit tricky in the context of ex-Soviet audiences. Perhaps, maybe you will ask me questions about that, and I welcome them. But the key desire in the studio was precisely to shift the focus from that sort of individual genius to the group and think together about the kinds of tools that we need in order to work in this new way. And so what we did in the studio in the spring of 2019 is we hypothesized that basically by engaging in retelling the pertinent aspects of socialist architectural and political history of Belgrade, and I'm going to refer to it as Yugoslavia because we were looking at the kind of historical Belgrade, not well in the context of current problems, but we wanted to learn from the kind of archive of political and architectural knowledge in that context, and think about alternatives for it that might be refracted through the values of that heritage. And we were interested in the kind of everything that we produce through this collective product to sort of produce or have a critical function on both sides of maybe the Cold War divide. So we considered 1989 with the Croatian thinker Boris Budin, who sees it in opposition to most colloquial sort of understandings of 1989, and certainly in opposition to someone like Habermas or Fukuyama, and thinks of it as something other than a kind of year in which the Eastern European countries were finally placed back on the path to liberal capitalism, which is how Habermas sees it. He sees this as a moment where these countries that have finally come into their own sort of political self-actualized sort of moment, they were immediately infantilized and sent back to figure out liberal capitalism and catch up with the rest of the West. So with Budden, we are looking at this sort of context and thinking that perhaps things that are important there, or that might be important for us today, might be different ways of thinking the collective. And so one of them is thinking about architecture that is produced as a collective good, in the context in which, you know, you have the right to housing, you have social ownership, and also architecture that is produced through a kind of self-managed group of architects as a kind of common authorship of sorts. Obviously, there's lots of traps in these histories. We were not looking at them as nostalgically as maybe this sounds at the moment. And in fact, what was important for me in that context was to also put myself on up for criticism by the students themselves, so that in a way, if there was nostalgia in my own view of this, the students involved in this now much more sort of horizontal group could critique that and in a way take it to task. But so we were doing this, thinking about what we called retro-utopian alternatives for Belgrade, which I can also unpack, but not immediately. We did that through 3 different acts. The first one produced, or we were interested in producing exercises in the kind of commoning devices for the studio that might in a way reframe how we work in studio with each other, and what would it mean to sort of do that, to change where the authority lies in the group, away from me and to the collective. And for that, we produced a series of garments and games, and even transformed the space of that studio as far as we could to help the kind of ethos of the studio. And then in the Act 2, we intervened in a kind of a competition in the context of Belgrade without yet seeing Belgrade. But we realized or learned through thinking about this particular park, which is a product of this socialist city design. We tried to intervene in the current discussion, which is a kind of a problematic one. It is a kind of a developer government in that context as well. So thinking about the park ahead of a few really crazy changes that were proposed there. And then finally, we were in Belgrade and we engaged with an amazing group of urbanists and architects who are also activists, who are squatting a number of different spaces to produce a kind of a site of artistic and activist production, and whose view it was that housing was the biggest question in the moment, at that moment. Housing that used to be part of a kind of a collective ownership structure in that context no longer, basically there's no longer any provision, even in a kind of Western notion of social housing. There is nothing that will in a way prop up those who have no access to housing. And so in collaboration with them, we in a way occupied sites that they had identified as being in this sort of legal limbo, in which we could maybe produce something that's a proposal both to local citizens and the governments, and intervene through a set of financial and architectural schemas. And finally, with all of this, in the end, we were interested in not operating, because we operated so unlike most studios in the US context. We were not interested in reviews the way that they are sort of generally established in that context. So, and this is partly because we were not we wanted to shift again who has the authority to speak about our experience over that semester and the outcomes of that experience. So the sort of final event, how we called it, was really a performance, an invitation, a kind of a party in which our formerly known as critic friends, joined us in wearing the self-management game that the studio designed, or the garments, as well as looking at objects we made without ever becoming a kind of an audience that has the capacity to judge them and tell us how we could have done it better, but to rather engage in thinking about what transpires in school and how it might be more beneficial for all of us if we're interested in cultivating a collective sort of attitude and not only reproducing the discipline as it is, how we might do that best, basically. So I know that was a long piece on the collective architecture studio. There's even more to it. We've been able to take pieces of it to different parts of the world to sort of play out, and especially this game that's based on self-management tenets from the Yugoslavian sort of thinking were played in many places. And certainly there are, again, ironic elements of that game that in a way reproduce some of the, issues with the way socialism landed. But there are also some really interesting ways of collaborating through that, and of sort of experiencing what collaboration requires. So I don't know if that, where that lands us now.
Well, I have a couple, I mean, maybe as a sort of transition, I do have some questions for you about that, as you were a kind of member of that studio. What was maybe one or two, what were some of the pushbacks, or what was an example of kind of things
there was one
happening
moment,
more?
Yeah, there was one moment where the students really, I had thought that there was a best way to approach the next step. And they collectively said, no, we're going to write our mission, and we're going to write our, come up with our sort of way of working and codify it for the group. And which, I found thrilling. But what for me was really an interesting experience as a faculty, right, was that even though, I was there, I didn't completely lose my faculty, sort of my authority in the project, but I did fundamentally reduce my sort of aesthetic judgment and input on things that in some other studio I might have done a little bit differently. Here I was very self-aware that in order to grow the collective, I could not be present as an individual with all of these judgments that I was imparting upon the students, that it had to be a much more organic more organic experience and set of outcomes. And that was not an easy thing to do, because we are used to the kind of the juridical relationship that we have towards our students and towards others' students when we are in juries. And in fact, I'd say that final event, there were a few moments where different faculty who was invited, every once in a while, they would start leaning into that role that is the role in which they judge the work, right? And so we had to, but we had a
while
few
they're
ways,
playing the game, to be like, I'm not, I feel critically about this.
yeah, we had a few ways of sort of returning the conversation and reframing it as an experience in which we, of course, acknowledge their expertise, but we are not, we're asking for them in a different way, through a different format. I'd say for me, the one thing where I felt like, oh, that's a little sad is where, which is just a kind of like my experiment provided feedback that I think is important, where basically we made very fast a diagram of the way in which the studio operated, because the way in which the togetherness worked was transforming throughout the semester, and they wanted to visualize that for the presentation or this final event. And then I saw myself not included in all of the kind of work at all the points where it could have been. So for me, that was interesting because it basically described the view from the students of my involvement with them, right? So, but still, I think that what was important in this case, when you take away the kind of the authority of the absolute authority of the teacher, even though I'm the one providing the kind of the framework for us to experiment with these questions, I think what you get is a kind of co-learning. And so I had to be open to learning about my own nostalgia, about, you know, my failure to do this, or maybe the impossibility of completely
I mean,
pulling
it's co-learning kind of within bookends, right? I mean, you mention in your article about this studio in Log about how, you know, you're still within the structure of the university, right? Like there are still grades, there are still, you know, the kind of semester's schedule of mid-review and final review and things. And so it's almost like, I think of it in the few experiments I've done in this kind of realm of collective studio governance as almost like a suspension of disbelief. So we all kind of enter into a little bit of a temporary compact with one another that we're going to simulate collectivity. Because there's no expectation that they're going to kind of grade each other, right?
Oh, well, but
or
we
is
did.
there?
We did. So with the grades themselves, we actually, that was one of the things that we opened up to a discussion. And so I offered a few models, but the only model that they all found adamantly all insisted on was a single grade for all of them. And so you know, we did push some of those pieces, but for me, what I thought was very important about going to Belgrade was this idea, and this is, again, I'm bringing this particular piece of, you know, sort of my own cultural memory to the table. And I'm saying, if we go to Belgrade, this is the place where there is still a memory, cultural, historical, of operating in a way that's different than what we do in the US. And so the hope was that even just seeing that sort of the fact that there is a memory of something other than liberal capitalism in that context would allow us to look at the context that we inhabit in the US and elsewhere where the students were from as problematic on a set of different registers. That basically, yes, it is possible to operate on behalf of all and not only on behalf of the kind of bottom line. And so while, and then secondly, this may not be the collective these students chose, but there are certain sort of experiences of the collective that are very important, that in simulating it, we in fact experienced it as such and grew it and cultivated it. And once we do that, then we have a set of tools by which we can think about what it would mean to cultivate collective over individual genius in the context of architecture, or not just to cultivate it, but also to value it, right? And so I do think that some of those experiences where, you know, there was a moment when the students themselves, are we together, are thinking about what does it mean to allow for everyone to, you know, to have a voice. There are some people who are not as forward as others. How do you ensure that everyone has the kind of the role that they are comfortable with and the role that truly contributes to the collective? What are the things that everyone has to do on their own to adjust their own behavior such that, you know, the collective in fact is organically sort of benefiting from it?
I mean, talking about kind of bringing in additional kind of latent archives or additional kind of alternate histories that maybe aren't the kind of dominant history to draw upon has a close connection. I mean, I'm just kind of taking a glance at our notes and thinking about some of the kind of present, most urgent issues that we've been thinking about in this, you know, global pandemic time, and also in a moment where many of us in the US are really kind of committing to the Black Lives Matter kind of mandate of self-education and anti-racist kind of thinking and practice and teaching. And those tools or those kind of bibliographies, I think I mentioned, as the currency that's exchanging right now. It's really going all the way back to, you know, the things that we managed to not read, you know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago when they were first written. Suddenly all of these bibliographies are circulating on Twitter, on, you know, listservs and stuff of how we talk about unlearning, but relearning as well. What other kind of perspectives are informing the ways we could be practicing. For me, the thinking about the tools, both of creating kind of increased collectivity or increased kind of ideas about how authorship could be managed in architecture, are part and parcel with the tools of the present moment, right? Like, I'm not walking into a studio space and saying, okay, everybody, it's 2:10, now we're going to have studio class. I'm clicking into a, you know, Zoom where who knows where my students are, and how can we reframe our togetherness at this moment and use it as an opportunity to have a different kind of togetherness.
I mean, I really do like the syllabi that have been traveling, or the reading lists that have been traveling through various media. For me, they are, as you suggest, a kind of a tool by which a collective rewires its self-awareness.
I love rewires.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking of it. I'm not thinking of it as relearning. I'm thinking of it as like, there are some things we have to unlearn and push back, and some things that need to take their place, and they need to be cross-connected in ways that we haven't done so far as a discipline, I think. And so I think this is where something that Ananya Roy describes as innocent modernity, for me, this is now, here we are now becoming less innocent, or understanding that our innocence is a crime, as someone like James Baldwin might suggest. So I do think that those are super important. It's really, maybe they seem banal, but I think they are essential, because they are also, there's something about also the simultaneity of all of us actually sort of being steeped in some of these readings now together but separately. And it makes me think also of the radio station that MARC students at MIT have started in April when we went online. They immediately anticipated that we would all be tired of Zooming together, and of that sort of mediation of our experiences. And we're interested in the kind of old archaic experience of voice in our ears simultaneously wherever we were, of the radio. And so managed to find a way that the department itself could sort of exist in that realm, both run by students and faculty, different shows. And so it was, I think, for me, the highlight of the 2 months of sort of finishing the semester on Zoom. And it also allowed the Critical Broadcasting Lab to put conversations on care into a kind of a medium that I think they always needed to have, which is a set of conversations with the stewards of architectural discourse. They might be editors or curators who dedicate their time to producing platforms on which others speak, and therefore not often have those platforms to speak about the kind of labor of love that goes into doing that. But for me, but that's a tangent. I wanted to talk about the radio as a kind of instrument or media through which that sort of collectivity can be produced, right?
Well, so for me, the important thing, and I loved listening to those, was listening to them in real time. So I'm in a different time zone from MIT. It was 3 hours different, and I had to, you know, set a special note of when different shows were occurring. But importantly, it's not a podcast. I think that's like when we talk about this radio station, it was about the immediacy of it. And so sometimes you would tune in and it would be like somebody, I mean, during one of your shows, there was a dropped connection. Yes. And you kind of hear the
me wondering about why.
Yeah, is this working? Is this on? I don't know. Like, oh, here we have, you know, everybody's back together. Let's continue talking. The kind of immediacy of a conversation, which is so much more personal, so much more connected, so much more kind of inclusive than a hyper-produced podcast with audio effects and, you know, editing in highlights of conversations. And that has to do, I think, also with the time of this bizarre period in our collective world history, where everybody suddenly, like, you know, like the pace suddenly slowed down briefly. Obviously, you know, things are kind of ramping up again. Where you have the moment to sit and listen to Anna, you know, reestablishing her internet connection on the radio. And I think it's a really like magical, we started with discussion of the portal, but it's a magical kind of inflection point that hopefully, you know, we're gathering some tools to make use of. I do want to note that we are near, we mentioned this earlier, we could probably keep talking forever, but we are nearly at an hour. So Alexander, if there's any kind of...
Well, let me just put also before the questions come in, I wanted to put maybe bell hooks on the table just to sort of have her as something. So for me, this was an important, bell hooks, an important theorist of transgressive teaching, or teaching for transgression is the title of her book that I found very useful, but also feminist Black activist. So what I wanted to sort of get from her for us is the kind of idea about vulnerability that she is interested in. So she argues for teachers exposing and performing their full humanity and acknowledging as well as engaging the students' humanity thus, and their specificity and their differences. And so she felt that it was equally important to treat the classroom as a space dedicated to learning beyond facts, as a space of testing and risk-taking, and a space that the students themselves could critique. And so this is, you know, especially important maybe for old institutions, but I'd say for all schools of, or sites of education. So now we have her too. Thank you.
I actually have lots of what you were talking about, especially concerned with the copying and reusing of material was resonating. And I have a couple of questions tied to this topic. And one is that so before the idea or the mechanism of copying and learning from historical precedents, where it's an essential part of architecture education from the very old times. And I think what is changing through the 1990s and in this century, that the depth of inquiry is becoming kind of lesser, and it's a flattening situation. We can now,
very diplomatic way to put it.
Yeah, and so I was thinking of the copy or the studying or copying of formal as opposed to learning from practices. And I think in any place or in any part of the world, there is some kind of historical background in architecture as practice, as a professional thing. I think for the United States, it's Gilded Years maybe, or I don't know, 1970s. I think in Russia, we kind of feel a little bit of lack of something practical to learn from the previous histories. But so what do you think of that? How is it a good way, or is it a necessary thing to balance or to confront formal copying by learning from practices and learning from professional experiences of architects?
I think an important, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I think an important aspect of what we were discussing, especially going back to the original kind of exhibition and seminar, is that we're not advocating any particular way of using the kind of fodder, just the kind of presence of it and the availability of it in a kind of not encyclopedic, but present. Part of the exhibit was a timeline to kind of put into context some of the ideas about copying and rules relative to copying in architecture that might be kind of trenchant for a student of architecture. So in terms of how do you use it, I think there's still, that space is still open. It's not that you say, okay, I've got this trope of the pyramid, or the, there's one type building mode we called pants, where a building looks like pants. It's not that, you should just take that and drop it, willy-nilly across the world, but that you can kind of bring your own experience and perspective to the way that you deploy it without fear of somebody saying that that is a kind of hollow reference. And I'm sure Anna has more on this.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation of the way that we thought of the exhibition itself, as sort of opening up and ensuring that, or sort of providing the body of work and thoughts about copying and originality as they have coursed through the discipline itself, right? And it goes up and down. There are certain alignments, and there are certain technologies that align with those opinions and options and positions. But for me, the question that I think you're asking, that's slightly outside of the exhibition itself, maybe takes us to the kind of notion that I think the discipline sort of contracts and expands in different points in time. And I think on top of that, I think, just understanding the historical circumstances that have aligned with particular sets of formal solutions is very important. This doesn't mean that those formal solutions and knowledge about them and expertise, or maybe even perfection at executing them, isn't something that we can at times, I think, delaminate from the historical circumstances and baggage that come with it. But I think we should, if we do that, we should do it for self-conscious reasons, right? And understand that, again, the kind of complexity of the circumstance in which we are, to the best of our ability, in which we are deploying formal solutions, that we now might have, ways of sort of absorbing or owning in our body. I also think, and this is something maybe now will take us a bit to the current moment also in the US, a kind of moment in which we are really rethinking what might it mean, or sort of thinking about what it might mean to have a kind of understanding and position on architecture that is a little less, as I said, innocent than what we have had. Formal sort of thinking is very innocent of the kind of historical circumstances from which it comes from. And I think for me, one of the most important articles over the last few years that I've been assigning to students has been Mabel Wilson's Changing the Subject Conversation in Art Forum, which, there are many other articles now to support this position. And certainly the book that they just produced, co-edited with Irene Chang, might have a lot of articles to help this. But her point in that article, that I think is sort of existentially problematic for all of us when we read it in the classroom with students. So, and I think importantly so, is the one that suggests that, our discipline was codified at the moment when the sort of greatest expansion in colonial world is happening. And so it's happening at the same time that a kind of a universal subject is codified, which happens to be a white, male, Western European subject. And that everything that basically, by not acknowledging this in the discipline, this is now, a long time ago. So the whole history of the discipline is coterminous with this kind of erasure at the beginning or codification at the beginning, which means that all of the kinds of things that I feel we have now as someone in my 40s has learned about the discipline, things that are tools by which I judge aesthetic objects that the discipline produces, are also codified by that moment. And what does that mean, right? When I think symmetry or composition or beauty, these are all outcomes of a very long sort of history of a very specific set of links that were made. And do we throw it out? How do we transform it? How do we rewire it? As I said, I think those are some of the biggest questions for us right now.
And how do you usher in, I mean, for me, thinking about just like very basic kind of syllabus building in the studio, like how do you bring that type of, for lack of a better word, uncertainty into the classroom with certainty, presenting the possibility that kind of the history that we need to be studying hasn't been kind of seamlessly articulated into a clear historical line yet, and hopefully maybe won't be, so as to leave open the possibility of many strands kind of simultaneously. How do you kind of present that to the beginning architecture student as at once a moment of certainty that we need to make change within the discipline, but also welcome to the discipline, here are the terms you need to know? That I think is a huge challenge, and something that really has to do with, you mentioned the kind of bell hooks kind of configuration of the classroom. It has to do so much with, at least in my experience, the kind of personal relationship that you have just by existing in the classroom with your students, saying, how are you receiving this information? Here's how I understand it. Here's how I'm coming to these questions. It doesn't take place from a lectern. It's much more in a circle. Yeah, certainly. Oy.
Yeah. It reminds me of an article that I once read in, I think it was the Journal of History of Architecture from 1970s. It was an article written by educators from Algiers. And the topic they were taking on was that after French left Algiers, and after they established architectural schools there, they realized that the process, the kind of desirable process of decolonization of the history of architecture and architectural teaching in general, is kind of leaving them without any sort of precedent, not in a narrative way, but also being in a space which is in architectural sense is quite homogeneous, right? So in this article they were expressing their kind of uncertainty about how to teach architecture which is not dominated by European experiences, European narrative, but at that point, or from their point of view, was lacking any other. I guess they managed to do that, but the problem was kind of stated in this way. We have a question from our audience, and the question is about collective practices in the studio. And so there are actually three questions. What types of negotiations do you envision in regard to heterogeneous but coherent common project when educating students? How is decision-making happening in regard to maintaining diversities, but still being creatively efficient? And is there a way to tackle social and political aspects through aesthetic methodologies in the playful yet serious studio culture? I think partly we touched upon this, but I think it's the same problem that discussed, but maybe the examples of something would be also interesting. How to balance freedom and delivery of certain program aspects in a studio.
Well, I can give one example, and that was based in being extremely explicit about the nature of the collectivity. So this is slightly different, quite different from Anna's example of the collective architecture studio. I taught a studio that was kind of based in a notion of the workings of improv comedy at The Ohio State University when I was teaching there. And I had an idea that we would kind of self-administer, the students and I would self-administer a studio in a kind of new collective way, in the way that an improv comedy troupe might organize themselves. And so rather than kind of having everything, including the kind of self-governance, be up for negotiation, part of the studio's mandate was to use a very explicitly improv comedy based yes and methodology. So for most of our kind of larger group discussions where decisions were made about design, and one of the kind of big prompts that I gave the students was to come up with a town plan. So the extents were up to them, the contents were up to them, but they needed to come up with a kind of collective space inside of which they would put their individual kind of designs. So we used a yes and methodology from improv comedy, which basically says, you know, when you're on stage kind of improvising with a partner, you take whatever they've given you and you say, yes, and I'm going to add on top of it, rather than contradicting. And so we went around in a circle around the studio table, and one student, you know, everybody has agency to speak when it's their turn. So somebody would say, and this is, you know, a school for dogs. And the next person would say, yes, and they're all highly intelligent, evolved beings. And the next person would build upon that. And so there was, as opposed to other types of collectives, no kind of veto power where you would say, you know, I disagree with what came before, but there was an accretive power of, you know, the good ideas that everybody kind of came to agree upon were built upon, and the ones that were maybe less fruitful or less exciting to others weren't mentioned again. So by the time we came around the circle, you know, 5 or 6 times, and it would take us hours to get around the circle every time, you would have a kind of consensus, a type of consensus, not necessarily, you know, the one that you would choose if you were administering an office, but a certain way of developing collective.
And for me, in the collective architecture studio, we were, you know, we were not interested from the outset in the heterogeneous yet coherent common project. We were interested in learning about how the collective might work. And so for that, I was always suggesting to students to actually take on some of the models of the way collectives might work around the topic and be self-aware as they try to implement them. And then so they were working with either, you know, kind of division of labor, or a kind of a foreman proposition where someone can guide others, or other sort of modalities that we can recognize as stereotypes of organizing a group, and then sort of undo those. So it's not like they ever quite embraced one of these models alone, but they were trying to think through what that means. Because for me, ultimately, the outcome of the studio, for me, the important pedagogical sort of lesson was not in producing a specific aesthetic outcome, but seeing how those aesthetic outcomes might correlate with the ways that they worked, so that in fact we were developing a kind of practicing the way in which one might make decisions in this context or that, and what kinds of products they would have. And then the kind of final question there about playfulness, that was a super important dimension of the collective architecture studio, and it was something that the students brought in, I think, in dialogue with me and maybe in critique of me to some extent, or of the program that was given to them, right? So when we asked for, or when I asked them for one-to-one devices, there was a lot of funny stuff that came out of that, and that I felt was in a way laughing at me with them, but also it was so sort of exciting and fun to engage the things that they produced, that they were able to transcend that sort of critique.
So what's an example of one of the one-to-one devices?
I mean, the one that I think, the one that we have taken to Seoul and Sao Paulo as well, is the game that was called Balls for All, which was basically a kind of the playground was worn by five members, by 5 players, and there were a set of different holes in that game that everyone had to sort of jump and move around to put the right balls in the right holes. They were sort of immobilized by the game, the way that they were wearing it. And there were a set of the difficulties went from followed the tenets of self-management, and went from everyone cooperates with full view of the game to put balls in the middle. Then there was a foreman, the only person who can see and who sort of suggests to others or guides others who cannot see anymore the game, where they need to move their bodies so that they can put the balls in the games. Then there was one where you had to give someone else a ball and not yourself. So there's a whole series of things where ultimately in every situation, either they all win or they all lose. And so they had to collaborate on that. But just the kind of the motions of going through that game were kind of hilarious. They would very easily sort of undo the serious studio culture every time we tried to play it.
Sounds like fun. We have another question. Maybe would like to rephrase it a little bit. The question is, what are the chances of finding a job after graduation, and what possibilities are there for implementing knowledge taught in university in practice? It's a kind of a very regular, but also still being very important question. I would maybe add to this one thing, that the collaborative practices and that critical approach in studio, which we're discussing now, I would say is not something that most of the employers would like to see in their recent graduates. Maybe, I don't know. Well, let's discuss it.
I can begin answering this in a way that's a little bit less sort of straight. So I understand this. Obviously, yes, the chances of finding jobs, who knows in the COVID era, what will happen, right? I mean, the kind of the millions of people who have lost jobs in the US, that is going to affect the architectural practice inevitably in the next, very soon. Like right now, we're still somewhere in our living rooms kind of watching it happen, but it's going to affect, and it has, right? But I think for me, what's important out of this question is that the cultivating collective practice and cultivating collective authorship over the genius author, I think is actually enabling a generation that is interested in something other than the kinds of practices that are in operation right now, practices that would value a group work very differently. And I think at least students at MIT are excited to be able to see a path towards reimagining what practice might be or mean. And so that's the hope. The hope is that some of this work isn't going to prepare you for working for SOM or even OMA, but it might enable you to begin work with your friends around a very different set of criteria and interests.
And that, sorry, we talk about, reproducing the discipline, reproducing the pedagogies that we've experienced ourselves. Like this is the truly kind of, for lack of a less dramatic word, revolutionary kind of potential of seeding collectivity into education. Is to, maybe somebody does go out into the world into a quote unquote traditional practice, but they still have within them the knowledge of how to kind of negotiate or operate in a more horizontal or a differently structured kind of environment. And then from there, you can take the skills or the tools that you learn in that traditional practice and use them elsewhere. For me, most of my students already, I'm astonished always when they have these, thoroughly established kind of aesthetic projects and websites and, small scale operations that they're already running as graduate students. They're fully capable. They know some of the, technologies and, methods better than their teachers do. There's no reason why they shouldn't be empowered to be out there kind of working outside of the top-down kind of genius principal model as soon as possible.
Yeah, I was what I wanted also to add to this question is that, and what you, Sarah, was saying just now, it kind of proves justifies my view. I think what we've seen through maybe last 10 years is a formation of a kind of parallel architectural world of small companies, artistically oriented, or small interventions oriented, and so on. And it's all very good, and especially good in a economy and society which welcomes that kind of very small but active architectural practices. But what we might also question is that how this parallel architectural reality, if it is parallel for just maybe from a distant observer, how it might affect the larger situations, the ones that, for example, are addressing or being addressed by Black Lives Matter or other things. So it kind of seems like a very introverted, encapsulated culture of recent architectural graduates from very kind of good institutions, but having not connected with reality.
Hopeful. I'm a little more hopeful than you are, I think, about what what might happen with the kind of this generation of students as it exits school. I mean, I think there are now certainly this kind of self-awareness and tools that are available for engaging community and for not, again, thinking about a kind of internal little cycle or circle of hermetic aesthetic discussions. I think most of our students right now are absolutely not interested in that format, or maybe not all of, maybe there's still a few, but I think there's a real understanding that that the situation in which architecture operates is complex, and that there are voices that are often not heard, and that there are ways by which one can engage them, right, and basically operate differently. I mean, it does require figuring out a way to, again, sidestep the market and the profit as the key way of sort of evaluating what you're doing. But one also, at least in the US context, has to find a way for that work to sustain you somehow. So there's going to be ways to sort of operating across through some things that are able to sustain you financially and things that are able to sustain you politically, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Just quickly, I'm reminded of this like incredibly powerful final paragraph in a posting that Mitch McEwen put up on ArcConnect recently, this past week, that is in response to some of the questions that she'd received from Architect's newspaper, but really it's in kind of conclusion, a bit of a call to arms to say, basically, stop making assumptions that what you think the discipline is it actually is. Stop thinking that our notion of, what is the traditional architecture education, what is the hegemonic discourse, actually is that's true for everyone. And for me, that's incredibly kind of optimistic and empowering to know that, or to feel that is kind of present, and that our students are aware, and that we can actively engage other, not just parallel, but present, contemporary, trenchant dialogues that are ongoing. And that, what we're talking about now as, the discipline is nothing. Like, that's not a thing. That's a thing that we're reproducing and talking about it as the discipline, yes. Like a notion of the top-down kind of architecture office model as the thing that students inevitably will graduate into. By talking about it as such, we help it continue to be. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm excited about this moment for stirring up and making louder a lot of the kind of things that many people have known to be true all along.
Discipline is what you make of it. Then.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And what we, those of us with a voice and who get invited to do these things, and thank you for the platform, get to kind of engage in reproducing. So I want to kind of say loudly, like, that's not the discipline.
Just one last question, incredibly complex, but maybe its complexity gives a way of answering it very shortly. How do you think, what's the most effect COVID will produce on architecture and urban development, typologically, aesthetically? What do you think? That's from the audience.
I think this one might be too soon.
Yeah.
One of those where, I know what I would like it not to do with much more clarity than what I'm able to imagine it doing, right? And so
and what is it?
Well, I think, for me, the kind of the being together, if this is something that we're going to somehow move away from, which I'm worried, like the question is sort of also seeing ahead, then I think we should resist it by all means, including, how it might rewire the School of Architecture through that. I think we should, again, all schools. Though I really appreciate the fact that I can be in Moscow right now. I think being together in person is not going to be so easily replaced. Or if we lose that, we are in bigger trouble than COVID alone.
Okay.
But it might, I'm not going to speculate.
No, the kind of horrific images of like plexiglass everywhere, that people previously could kind of be in contact is a little bit of a horror show.
Okay. We actually arrived to the end of the time that we have for this conversation. And I'd like to thank, first of all, everyone who was with us viewing and listening in Zoom or on YouTube. And to thank, of course, our guests, Anna and Sara, for joining us today for this conversation. It was really very, very interesting. And also I'd like to thank our interpreter, Leah Berlidze, for her contribution to this conversation. And just to say in the end that our next meeting will be actually very soon on Thursday, featuring architects, planners, and educators, Lucy Bullivant and Alexandra Eriksson Furness from London and from Norway. And follow our announcements on social networks and the website of the program, deschooling.march.ru. Thank you very much. See you next time, and hope to see Sara and Anna in real world, in real life.
Yes. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.